So last episode, we worked on small blind versus big blind out of the small blind's perspective. Today, I'm going to work on the big blind's perspective. We are going to be combining the scores there for the total percentage for the spot importance spreadsheet that we showed earlier, and that's going to indicate whether we need to either work from the small blind or the big blind's perspective. More specifically, if we look through our GTO wizard drills, so I'm going to make a GTO wizard drill right now, and we're going to get into that. So let me open up here. We're going to add a new drill, and we're going to have everything the exact same, but we're just going to switch out the two positions. So I am now playing out of the big blind and the opponent is playing out of the small blind. So we looked at the small blind strategy pre-flop yesterday. I'm going to name this Study Chronicles, big blind versus small blinds. There we go. So we looked at pre-flop extensively before we went into the drills. We're going to do the same exact thing today for the big blind versus a small blind open. And then we will move on to the next scenario after we drill it for a few reps. But first things first, let's look at pre-flop. So if I open up the study, we'll look at the small blind raising. Now, we're using the general 500 GTO ranges, as I mentioned in the last episode. If you haven't yet watched the first episode, I recommend checking it out. It explains the whole process of what I'm about to do and why we're doing it. So yeah, we're going to go over the response to small blinds opening 3x. The small blind can also have the option of limping. That's something that we also can cover in depth as well. But for today, I'm just going to look at the opening 3x and how the big blind is going to defend. Not 3-bet, so just call, but defend. And it looks like we are going to be mostly calling 9s and under as the top end of our calling range, because we are 3-betting 10s plus pure. We're also 3-betting the stronger ace-x suiteds, ace-x offsuits, and a little bit of the wheel suited aces. So ace-5, ace-4, and a mix of the ace-3. But for the most part, everything else is going to be a flat. Have some suited connectors that are close to a pure 3-bet. So you have hands like 8-7 suited, 7-6 suited, etc. But yeah, so understanding where our threshold is for the big blind is important whenever I'm looking at a range for calling, 3-betting, whatever. I'm always looking at the threshold hands, which means I'm always looking at the bottom part of the range. This is the way that I typically remember some of the hands, because when you're playing with such wide ranges, sometimes it's hard to really understand exactly why Jack 5 suited and 6-4 suited are in that range, but you just know that they're in that range. Some ranges are going to be tight enough so that you can kind of get an understanding of why, as you tighten a range, you peel back on some of the weaker hands. But when both ranges are very wide and you're defending in probably the widest position now out of the big blind, that's going to be more of a memorization game, if you will. But understanding why you're 3-betting certain hands, that might be a different heuristic, right? Okay, so looking at the bottom range, 5-4, 6-5, 7-6, 8-7, 9-7. And then we have some aggressive 3-bets with King 5, Queen 6, Jack 7, 10-7 as bottom range. So certain bottom hands are falling into the 3-bet range, and those are the ones that are going to have better blockers to really strong hands, I imagine. So because the 4-betting range from the small blind is going to contain 10s plus at a high frequency, I think you're going to see a lot of using those blocker cards in the big blind's 3-betting range. So you're going to see 3-betting 10x suited because that removes 4 bets from the big blind, or sorry, from the small blind. Also seeing hands like suited kings, suited aces. Those are always going to be good hands to 3-bet, removing really strong hands from the original opener. And then you have some playability hands. You have hands that are, going to play well post flop that may not want to just flat. So hands like Jack 9 suited, 10, Queen 10 suited, King 10 suited, all of these hands that are going to have a lot of equity post flop, make strong hands, et cetera, et cetera. So the flatting combos are going to mostly be high cards that don't fall into either a value range or like a good blocker hand range that's going to be more polarized. And you'll see there is a fairly polar strategy here for 3-betting out of the big blind. That is because we are the last to act. We're not looking to isolate a player. We're not worried about players behind us waking up with hands. This is our only scenario where we're facing a raise from the small blind. And when that happens, we're going to have some obvious value. And then we're going to have some hands that we want to be 3-betting and folding to a 4-bets as bluffs. So the way that the solver likes to usually construct a big blind 3-betting range is very polar. And then the calling range is going to be, I don't want to say, I guess you could say it's capped and condensed in some ways. So it's going to be condensed towards this middling strength kind of textures. So like queen high boards, queen jack, jack 10, jack 8, jack 9 type boards. Those are going to hit our range really well as the big blind after defending the flop or the pre-flop, sorry. So yeah. So looking at that, understanding what our range looks like, we already looked at the small blind and what they're doing. We have to understand some of our shortcomings of what hands are not going to be in our calling range so that we can defend properly on certain textures. I don't think there's much else to look at in this particular node. This isn't a 3-bet pot. This is just a single raise pot. So we're just going to look at this defending range. We're not looking at, 4 bets against our 3 bets, etc. And so I think we can just create a drill for this and get into it. I think the first thing I will do when we start getting into the drill is look at the aggregated reports again. So looking at our overall strategy of how we're going to deal with facing c-bets. And that will come up next. Also, we're going to look at what happens when villain checks to us. So as we play this drill, we're going to see the strategy start to develop for the big blinds. All right, let me play here and jump in. Okay, so right away, first thing happens, small blind checks out of position, which is going to be a high frequency play, as we learned earlier in the first episode. What the small blind is going to do, they're going to check a lot, and they're also going to small bet a lot. So if you were to prep playing as the big blind against the small blind, I would recommend prepping for villain to check, and I would prep for villain to bet small, and that will cover you for a very large frequency of scenarios right away. Then you would work into, okay, what if villain uses a larger size bet? What if they use an over bet? And then how to respond to that. There we go. Is this cash or tournaments? This is cash games. Everything that I'm doing is for cash games. All right. But welcome to the stream. All right. So what are we going to do when villain checks? Well, this is a good time to pull up the aggregated reports. So we're going to go through the different options. All right. So this is going to be aggregated reports. So this doesn't matter what the flop is. It's just this could be any flop, doesn't matter. What does matter is this part up here, which is our overall strategy. of when the small blind raises pre-flop to 3x, big blind calls, and then the small blind checks. This is our strategy. We are using 4 different sizings. I typically use 4 different sizings in most scenarios. You can use less. I already talked about that in the last video as well. But I use 4, and this is what our strategy looks like. It looks like we have a fairly consistent, balanced frequency for 33, 50, and 75. 4 sizings, yeah. It's sometimes tricky to implement, but the more we study, the more we understand why we're using a large size, why we're using a small size, why we're using a medium size, the more intuitive it becomes, the easier it is over time. It's like anything else, right? It's just going to take a little bit more time to really get your head around it. But once you do, it's very rewarding to understand why you're using 4 sizings. Anyway, looks like we're using all 4 sizings, right? There are some scenarios where we're not going to ever, overbet, or we're never going to use a small size. But in this scenario where a small blind checks to the big blind, we have every single sizing. So this is going to present some interesting options, right? Because now we're going to have to think back to our game theory training and understand, okay, is this a texture where we have a lot of good hands and we want to see bet a lot? Or is this a texture where we don't have many good hands and we want to be more polar and use a larger sizing? So we're gonna test our theory knowledge with this scenario for sure. This is a very good scenario to practice if you want to work on bet sizing theory. 4 sizings on each flop, yes. Yep. That being said, sometimes certain flops don't use all of the sizings, like I was mentioning. For example, this spot here, I don't think we're going to have an overbet on an ace queen 10 board, because this board is just so good for the small blind. Because remember, we looked at the big blind's weakness, which is ace and queen type combos. We don't have ace queen suited. We don't have the strong broadways. We don't have 10s plus, right? So this is like the perfect board for small blinds, and a really bad board for us. So I think we're going to do a lot of checking. First of all, we're going to check back a lot versus a check. And then we're also going to, as we saw here, actually in the aggregated reports, the most common thing we're going to do is check, right? So we're going to check a lot on this texture. And then if we do bet, I think we're probably going to bet large, large or medium. And so this hand, I think, is just going to check this time, but I could see us betting large, not really having a small bet size on this texture, again, because if we are going to bet, I think it's going to be very polarized. So I'm going to check this time. Looks like this one was a large bet or even an overbet. So there's that overbet. And that would make sense because overbet is the ultimate polarization, right? If we're going to have an overbet, we want to do it with a polar type of range. And this hand happens to be very polar in that it blocks the nuts and it has a little bit of equity that can make a straight. And it might be one of the worst Jack X combos we have. So typically when the solver is trying to figure out which hand it wants to use as a bluff, it's going to take the worst hand in a category that still has relevant blockers to the nuts. And so this one falls into that category nicely. And that's why I guess we're seeing this overbet here. But check is still fine. We're going to continue with that check. And then if we get to the turn, small blind, let's see what they do. They check again. I still think we can have this this bet. I think this is a fine spot. Now that they check twice, I think we will see a very high frequency bet here. Are we going to bet 90% of the time though? That's a question difficult to answer. I think we're going to still have a decent check frequency. I think if we were going to have a semi-bluff at this point, we would want to have a little bit more equity, so maybe something with spades. But again, having a blocker to the nuts, blocking Queen Jack also is really nice. If villain has something like pocket nines, pocket eights that they played this way, they're just going to have to fold. So we're unblocking their folding range with this hand, which is really nice. I could see this being a bet 75 or even a bet 125 option. Let's go with bet 75. Nice. So there is no check. There is no check. We're really ramping up our aggression here on the turn with this combo. Interesting river. So now at this point, we have a jack kicker, which is actually, it could win at showdown because like we said, they could easily have something like pocket nines or 10x perhaps that now just got counterfeited on this river. So do I want to bluff? Do I want to bluff this river particularly? Oh, what are we doing here? We're going to be very polar for the river. This might be one of those spots where we just like bet 300% or check because we're essentially repping an ace. And the only hands that we're trying to fold out at this point are going to be a queen because everything else, I guess we can fold out king high, which is relevant here. Interesting spot. My first instinct was to check because I was thinking they're going to get counterfeited by some combos. And then we would bluff something a lot worse than jack high here. I think we would bluff something like maybe 6-5 of spades that we check back the flop with, right? This does still have really good blocking properties though to turn into a bluff. So I'm kind of torn between like betting 150 or betting 300 and checking. I don't think we're going to have a large bet. I think it's only going to be an overbet or a check. Let's go with check because I rolled really high. I don't think this is going to be a pure bluff, but it could be. I'm going to hit check and I might be wrong here. Nope. Okay. This is actually a pure check. Probably for the reasons I was mentioning where we have some showdown value with this combo. So if we wanted to look more into what, our bluffs would be, we could just quickly go over the study spot. And see on the river what hands are going to be bluffs and what sizing should we use, right? So we see, first of all, that we're checking 71% of the time, very high frequency. We have a little bit of the 50% bet here, representing a queen. Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. So if we have a queen, we don't want to go really large because not too many worse hands can call us if we have a queen. As I mentioned before, the 10 got counterfeited. Maybe they have king high that needs to bluff catch. But if we do have a queen, so it looks like the solver is splitting into two different categories. It's using the 50% sizing for our queen X value, and then it's going to use, like I was saying, the 150 or the 300 for the ace high value. And for the 300 or the 150, the best bluffs are going to be exactly these smaller, like weakest hands that are going to be in our range. So hands like the 6-5 suiteds, the hands like 6-5 offsuit, 7-3 suited, the bottom of the bottom are going to be used as the really large size for polarized ranges. All right, moving on. Queen 8-3. So again, small blind check. Most common scenario that we're going to be faced with. This hand has some okay properties for bluffing. It has a backdoor straight draw around the 3, and it has an overcard to the queen. That being said, ace high itself has some showdown value, but obviously the worst ace high you get, the less showdown value there is. This one probably has a mix of, if I had to guess, bet small or bet medium and check. I don't think we're going to go large with this hand. Doesn't have great backdoor equity. We'd rather have a backdoor flush draw for betting when check to here. So I'm going to check this time. But it does look like we are going to either check, bet small, or a little bit of bet large. Now on the turn, let's see what happens. So again, I think I have enough showdown value. We rolled a large number, so I think being passive is going to be good. Going to check here. Again, we can now start mixing some large or overbet, even setting our hand up for a bluff on the river. If a heart comes in, maybe when we block the 4 of hearts, blocking an ace of clubs blocks a lot of the really strong hands from small blind. If the small blind is trying to slow play something like pocket aces for a check raise or ace queen or whatever. Also, even just blocking ace 8 is very relevant now because villain could have that. And if we're blocking the ace, less likely they have hands they can call by the river. So having the ace is just good in general, which is why we see a little bit of mixing the bluff there. Rivering the 4, I think we're just going to call here. I don't think we want to turn our hand into a bluff. We beat some of their bluffs that are going to have a small size. So I think I'm just going to pure call. And villain shows up with an 8. Unfortunate. 9 high board, again, small blind checks. We're just seeing this trend. So we have all of the options, if you recall. What do we want to do with a hand like this? Well, we have backdoor straight draws. We don't have any overcards to the board. Doesn't make for the best kind of semi-bluff here. I think something like Jack 10 would be a better semi-bluff hand. This hand may want to see a free card so that we can turn more equity. I rolled a 62, not a very aggressive number. I think since we're universally checking around 60% with our strategy, this wouldn't be a bad spot to check. That being said, it's probably okay to have all of the options here other than maybe overbet. I'm going to check this time, and it looks like that's correct. We have bet small, bet medium, and bet large. No overbetting here. Typically, you're going to want to overbet with hands that have more equity. Yeah, looks like checking is okay. Betting small is okay. Betting medium is okay. On turn, let's see what happens. Does this texture favor big blind flat? Which one? The 9 high board? No. I don't. So mostly high card rainbow textures are going to favor the small blind. The ones that are going to favor the big blind are going to be the low connected boards. So 6, 4, 3, 5, 6, 7. Those kind of textures are going to favor the big blind over the small blind. 9 high rainbow boards are going to favor the small blind because the small blind is naturally just going to have more overpairs like 10s plus, right? So anytime that there's a board texture where overpairs have a lot of value, typically the range with the more overpairs is going to have the advantage. That being said, the small blind is just checking with a lot of its range anyway. So we're going to get check raised a lot, in fact, on a 9 high board when small blind checks. Okay. So on turn, again, we're faced with another decision. I don't think we're going to have a small bet. We're going to either have a large bet or an overbet, I think. Maybe some medium bets, but mostly checking because we don't have any equity at this point. We have 8 high. It might not be a terrible idea to turn this into a bluff, but just the lack of blockers, the lack of equity, just makes me think that this is a hand that might be better to bluff by the river if we get there, right? Typically, you want to pick hands that have equity on the turn to bluff with. So I check here, but lo and behold, there is some overbet here. There is some polarization with this hand. Like I was mentioning, doesn't have much equity. So if we are going to win the pot with this hand, we're going to have to overbet. We're going to have to make a large bet here. Or we can also have a small sizing setting up for a river bluff. I'm surprised that there is a small sizing here. I wouldn't have guessed that there was a small sizing. I think I mentioned I was going to either large bet or overbet, but it looks like it's either going to really polarize on this king turn, or it's going to have this more mergy small sizing, maybe with something like 9x that checked back the flop, maybe something that needs more protection like pocket 6s or 5s or a 4x. I don't know. But looks like check is still a good option. I am surprised at how much it is overbetting. That is something that I don't intuitively do, but maybe I need to think more about with my weaker hands. Facing a bet on river is just an easy fold. I don't think we have any good blockers for turning our hand into a bluff. So we'll go into the next one. Again, 9 high board facing a check. This hand, I think, is typically going to check back. Again, doesn't have much equity on this texture. We have some backdoor draws with the 7. We have an overcard with the king, but I think we're going to be a bit more selective with what hands we want to be betting here for value. And as bluff, it doesn't really feel great. I think maybe the solver will mix it ever so slightly just to, because it's not very good for showdown, so it's still going to have to bluff at some point in the hand, and having the 7 is somewhat relevant. So I think we're going to see some mix here, but mostly check. So I'm going to go ahead and check. Oh, our first inaccuracy out of the big blind. Yeah, it looks like the solver does really want to be aggro with this hand here. Again, no overbets though. Using the small, medium, and large sizings. I guess the 7 is relevant enough, and having a king overcard is good. So yeah, we missed that opportunity there. Anytime I get an inaccuracy or a blunder, I do make sure to kind of look through and study the spot after the hand's over. Once the ace hits on the turn, I think we actually have more showdown value and we have less fold equity. So now I'm going to start checking 100%. And same thing on river. I don't think we want to be bluffing king high. We'd rather be bluffing something like 10 high, jack high, queen high before we're bluffing a king high combo. Okay. Let's actually look at that hand. That's interesting on the flop that it chooses to bet so often. Maybe a 9-5 3 board is more connected for the big blind and has a higher frequency bet when checked too. Let's see. 50% check. So a little less than average, right? We have for our average check frequency 63%. So this board is probably above average for betting, for being more aggressive. And so what hands does the solver want to use? It looks like king high is going to fall into the weak hand category. And it looks like king high, especially king 7, is a very aggressive combo here. I suppose that's because the 7 is very relevant, blocking 7-6, blocking 7-4, 7-8, pocket 7s, of course, and just having that potential future blocker for bluffing. So if the 6 comes off, we turn a straight draw. If the 8 comes off, we turn a straight draw. We can hit a king. A 7 still might be good to win the pot. So I guess this is actually a better hand for bluffing the flop than I first assumed. It's one of the most frequent hands to be betting the flop with, other than 6-4, which is, the best hand, of course, because we have the most equity. It can make the nuts. Makes sense, right? But yeah, prioritizing a lot of these 4x hands and some of these weak 7x hands, 7x hands, 6x hands. So usually when you see bluffs, it's going to revolve around something that can pick up equity on the turn, something that blocks the future nuts, something that has a backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draw, etc. And when there's a rainbow board texture, it's going to typically pick the hands that have the straight draws with the backdoor flush draw if it can, and if it can, it's just the straight draws. Whereas if there's a flush draw out there, then just having a single card of the flush draw is going to be more relevant. All right, next hand. A7-4 versus a check. So I know from past study that any ace high board is going to be a very polarized range for us to bet. I don't think we're going to be using the small size too often. So if we do bet, it's going to be an overbet or check. That's typically what I've played. It's been a long time though since I've looked at this, so maybe it's not as polar as I had thought, but I'm going to check this time with this hand, rolling an 82. This is a passive number. Anytime we roll really low, so like let's say I think I'm going to overbet here with 5-4 offsuit about 10% of the time. If I roll a 10 or under, just to clarify, that's when I would use the overbet. So I'm going to check this time. And it looks like there is a small sizing that is used, which means I need to take a look at this strategy because it's been a long time since I've looked at something like this. So in fact, there is a lot of small betting. I am incorrect about that. The check frequency is close to the average on this texture. But the small bet frequency is something I wasn't really prepared for. We do have an overbet though, which some boards don't even have the overbet. So we do have an overbet. It's going to be more polar than something like 5-4. It's going to include mostly, I think, spades if we have it, hearts if we have it. You'll see if I add in the weak hands here, the spades will pop up. There we go. Some backdoor straight draws, again, having like an 8, having a 5, having a 6, those are all very relevant. You can see here in the overbets that we have an 8, a 5, or a 6 most of the time. So when you start breaking down categories of hands into just having like a certain card, it becomes a lot easier to think about, right? And the ones that are going to be higher frequency are the ones with more equity. So the ones with the actual gut shot straight draw are going to be a higher frequency of bluffing than the queen 5, which has only backdoor equity and maybe like an okay kicker. So like thinking in terms of how to construct ranges, I get asked this a lot, like, oh, do I just memorize all this stuff? Like, what do I do? Well, break everything down into categories, okay? Like, does this hand have good blockers? Does it have good future equity? Does it have, you know, more direct equity with making hands right now? Does it have, what part of my range out of those hands is the solver going to want to use as a bluff first? Is it going to use the ones with less showdown? Is it going to use the ones with more showdown? So something like king 6 here might not be as high of a priority bluff as something like 8-5, right? Or 8-6. So I do check the turn, or sorry, check the flop. And now we get to turn. I think at this point, we just want to get to showdown. We have a pair, we have a lot of equity. We don't want to get raised if we bet. So I think this might be a pure check unless we're turning our hand into a bluff, in which case I think we might want to go really large. So I'm going to check this time. Nope. There is some small bet in there. Okay, so we still can put in some small bet, maybe getting value at this point from something like king high, something like king queen, something like a spade draw that they're checking twice. I don't know, but there's the king on the river, and I don't think I want to bluff ever. Gonna just check. So good. But yeah, on the turn, we would have gotten value from king 9 if they had check called, right? So looks fine because we can call a check raise. Yeah, we can call a check raise on turn, going for, I guess, I don't know if it's protection or because maybe we're setting up for a river bluff on the turn for using the small bet. These are all questions that I need to be asking myself all the time in order to get better, right? In order to improve my strategy and understand how I'm going to play out of the big blind, I need to understand how the solver is, you know, constructing these ranges, how the solver is going to set up hands for the future. So on the turn, I think if we bet turn, I don't think we're going to use it as a bluff on the river because I think we can still win at showdown. I think they're going to have to check call some like weaker king high hands. So we could double check that really quick. Surely bet turn, check river versus brick spades. Yeah, I think we're going to see check river if we do bet the turn. So let's say we see, or we could perhaps overbet river. We could just like shove the river as a bluff, blocking all of the nuts and strong hands with our 4, right? So let's say we do bet small, and then the river's a brick. What was it, a king, I think, in the example? King of clubs. So now we see 5-4. 5-4 is in fact just checking back. So the bluffs the solver is going to probably use are hands that don't have showdown value, that have a blocker to the straight. So something like 8x, 5x that we bet the turn with, right? That we picked up equity. So let's double check that. We can have a bet 135, we can have a bet 60, and our trash hands are in fact going to be hands with 5x in them. We have some 3x in them even, because those are going to be some of the weaker hands on the turn that we start betting because it picks up some equity, right? Going back to the equity thing on the turn. Looking at some hands like 8x again. So no surprises. Like, you're not going to be surprised too often by the solver when it chooses bluffs. It's going to be something that had equity on the turn that gets to the river and has no showdown value. So this is not only good for studying big blind versus small blind, but this is just good for playing in position in general, right? So if you're someone who has a button flatting strategy or cutoff flatting strategy, this is all very relevant still. All right, here we go. Now we have a really strong hands on a 9 high board. I think we're going to see a lot of large bets with this hand. I think we're going to see a mix of small bets, medium bets. We still should have some check though, because it's still important to check balanced on this flop. We don't just always bet our really strong hands on flop, because if we did that, then if we bet every single spade combo on the turn, when a spade comes in, the small blind can just blast against us and we're forced to fold, right? So we do in fact check back some spade draws here. That being said, I think we would rather check back a weaker spade draw that doesn't have a straight draw also. So yeah, I think this one's going to be a pretty high frequency bet, and I think we're going to be using a mix of all of these three sizings here, maybe even an overbet. I am going to bet 50 this time. So it was bet 33. I really wanted to bet 33, but I just decided to go in between 75 and 33 because, you know, but yeah, see, here's the check frequency, like we mentioned. And on this texture, it doesn't look like there is any overbets. I think we still have established that there is no overbet on a 9 high board, because this would be a pretty good hand to do it with. So yeah, so bet 50 is good. And we make our flush. Now, here's a concept we haven't covered yet, is that when you're playing on the turn and the draw comes in, whether it's the flush or the straight, typically a lot of things change. First of all, if we have the strong hands, we want to get paid, right? We don't want to just immediately polarize our range and start betting over bets with all of our flushes, because the hands that small blind is going to continue with are going to be combos that have a pair, maybe that have a spade in them as well. So like a hand like 9-8 offsuit with the 8 of spades can continue here, but because we're blocking the 8 of spades, it's less likely they're going to have strong hands to continue with. So when we're betting here for value, let me dog out real quick. There we go. So when we're betting for value, we are having a large size. Sometimes we're going to have an overbet, I think, but we're going to be very selective with our overbets. On a monotone board, the only hands that really want to overbet twice here are going to be the nuts. They're going to be the nuts or the king high flushes. So I think we're going to see maybe some overbets, but I think mostly large bets or medium bets are going to be the play here. Now, I did roll a 1. This is the strongest action we can get, right? 1 is the best roll when we're using a low RNG. So if we ever overbet, this is the time to do it. But I don't think we're actually going to overbet. I think it's going to mostly be a 75%. So I'm going to click this one. And it looks like I was right. 75% is the most aggressive action and the largest size that we're going to use in this scenario. Uh, 4-3-2, interesting board. So small blind versus the big blind. this is a good texture for us, right? We have all of the nuts. We have 5-6 offsuit, which is actually going to be more common than the small blind because small blind isn't going to be raising that hand. They're only going to be raising 5-6 suited. And so we're going to have the nuts more often than the small blind. We're going to have pocket 4s. We're going to have pocket 3s. We're going to have pocket 2s. We're literally going to have more nutted hands than the small blind is in the scenario. So I can see us having a high frequency, small sizing bet, or I can see us having a mix of check, maybe some half pot, but I don't think we're going to want to overbet too often here. I think we're just going to bet small at a high frequency. And this is a good hand to bet with because obviously we have top pair, straight draw, backdoor flush draw. This is going to be a good hand to bet small. So I do, in fact, bet small here. I can also bet medium, and I can use the large sizing. I don't know if we're going to have an overbet, but I guess we can check real quick. I'm actually curious myself if we do have an overbet here. You 3-bet a lot with ace-5 offsuit? Not a lot, but low frequency. Let's see. So when checks, yeah, not really overbetting too often. Overbetting is a very uncommon play. And it looks like the board textures where we want to overbet are those ones like I was mentioning earlier, the ace high boards that are really good for villain, that polarize our range, right? So when we're betting on ace 10-4, we're either going to go really large or we're going to check. Same thing with a board texture like ace queen 5, like ace jack 8. So this board texture doesn't fall into that category. This is just going to be an aggressive bet here. Interesting, we get check raised. I think we can maybe mix in playing this more aggressive. Maybe we can put in a raise, but I think our most common play is going to be just to call, and I rolled passive, so we're going to call. Yeah, we do have a little bit of a raise here because this hand just has so much equity. Having top pair, having the straight draw, having the backdoor straight flush draw. This hand is strong on this board texture. Also, villain is going to have some bluffs, right? And we want to protect against those. So if villain has something like queen 10 of hearts or whatever, this hand is going to do well by putting in another raise. Okay, board pairs, small blind checks, and now we have the option of small betting or checking. Again, if villain has something like queen 10 of hearts here, it would make a lot of sense for us to bet small. So I think betting small here is an option. I think check is an option, but we rolled aggressive, so I'm going to use the small bet. And lo and behold, small bet, check, and a little bit of medium size. Now on the river, I think we just have showdown value. If villain check called something like ace high of spades on the turn, right? I'm just going to check here. King, so there's the king high of spades. So they did check call a flush draw, and we do win on the river. What is our 3-betting range on the flop? What value we want to 3-bet, and what is our calling range? Are you talking about the 4-3-2 spot versus the check raise? It's going to mostly consist of very strong hands like straights, sets for value, maybe some 2-pair, and then the other hands are going to be calling like top pair with a straight draw, flush draws, backdoor flush draws with a pair, etc. Okay. Anytime you have a 3-bet range on a flop, it's going to be very polarized. It's going to be very strong. And so your continuing range is going to be some traps and then mostly medium strength hands that have showdown value still against weaker hands. A7-2. Well, here's our first facing a bet, I think. Is this the first time we're facing a bet since we started? Maybe. But no surprise that it's going to be a small bet, right? Now, facing a bet, what is the aggregated reports telling us, right? This is something I don't think I've looked at yet. So we're going to go to the info. look at the reports versus a c-bet versus a small c-bet. So here are the options against a small c-bet. First of all, again, call is always going to be the most frequent thing to do. Same thing with check. The passive, so this is a weird heuristic that I don't think a lot of people talk about, but most of the time you're taking passive lines in solver strategies. You're checking a lot, you're calling a lot. Betting and raising is the least frequent thing that you do in solver strategies and equilibriums facing aggression. There's not too many scenarios where you're going to raise more than you're going to call, or that you're going to bet more than you're going to check when checked to, unless it's a very specific board texture, unless it's a very specific SPR, right? Like it's in single raised pots. I should be more specific with that. Sorry. In single raised pots, you're going to take passive lines, I think, more often in general. Okay. So versus a small bet, you'll see that we're mostly calling, and then we have two options. We have raise 50 and raise 100. Raise 100 is going to be on those textures, again, that are really good for villain, that maybe give us a lot of equity as well. So like something like King 10-6, where we have a lot of straight draws, where we still have some really strong hands like pocket sixes and King 10. Same thing with something like Queen 8-7, where we have like pocket 8s and pocket 7s and Queen 8 and Queen 7, and a lot of draws. I think a lot of straight draws are going to influence whether or not we raise here, because we're going to have more equity with those hands, especially the offsuit combos. And remember, we talked about what board textures were good for the big blind in general. It was those medium strength board textures like Jack 8, Queen 8, 9-7, 9-8. And you see that reflected in these boards here for what is the best to raise large with, right? So you see all of these. I like to look at not the top card, but the other two cards on the texture. And they all have this very similar trend, right? They're connected enough that there's a lot of straight draws present, and that we still have the suited connector combos that we have for defending the big blind. So 9-8, 9-7, 10-6, 10-9, all of those combos. We have a lot of straight draws around those. We have a lot of two pair combos around those, and we still have all of the sets around those, except for maybe 10x, but yeah. So yeah, so those are the ones that we want to be raising 100% on, and then raising 50% on. You'll see it's more of the textures that are good for us, that are maybe we have even a strong advantage over the small blind on. So yes, those other ones that we just looked at for the raise 100 were good for us, but they still had like a high card on them that allowed the small blind to have the advantage, or they had like an ace on them, or a king or queen, or there was maybe, two Broadway cards on them. But these textures where there's no good card for the small blind, we just absolutely cover, right? So a 7-6-5 board, we can have literally all of the nuts on that texture, not just most of the nuts, which is funny to say, but yeah, looking at, ranges, you can compare and contrast whatever it is that you want to look at for each flop and see who actually has the best hand advantage. So those are the textures we're going to raise at a higher frequency. So how does ace 7 deuce fall, right? That doesn't really fall into either of those categories. Well, this isn't really a really strong board for villain, but it's not really a good board for us either. So I would guess that we're going to have a very small raise frequency. It's going to be large, and we're mostly going to continue with the call. That's my guess. We rolled passive here. This hand, I think, can mix between raise and call, because usually bottom pair is an okay hand to start turning into a bluff. Because again, it has enough equity. It blocks really strong hands. It has a backdoor flush draw. It has a backdoor straight draw. This one might be aggressive with raising, actually, now the more I think about it. But I'm going to call this time, rolling a 65. So yeah, exactly. It is a bit more aggressive because of everything I just listed. It has good equity. It has backdoor equity. It falls into all those categories. Bottom pair with backdoors is a good in position raise. Yes, exactly. Weaker bottom pairs. So if we had king 2 here, it would be less good than 5-2, right? Now versus a check, we have a decision to make. Do we want to polarize and start bluffing with this hand, right? This is a turn card that is good for us. Okay, so anytime you have a turn card good for us, we have to think, okay, should we bet here now? Because most of our range is going to improve. Not most of our range, sorry. A portion of our range is going to improve. So hands like 5-4, hands like ace-3, hands like 7-3 suited, hands like 2-3 suited, right? Pocket threes now make a set. There's a lot of hands that can improve on this turn. There's also a lot of hands that pick up equity. Ace-4, ace-5, 7-5, 7-4. All of these combos pick up straight draws. So do we want to bluff with this hand? Maybe. We would rather have something with more equity, though. We would rather have something with diamonds, maybe that we floated the flop with. So something like 8-9 of diamonds, maybe something like 5-6 of diamonds. Those would be really good combos to use as a bluff. This hand, I don't know. I think this hand can go either way. This is an aggressive roll though. What sizing would we use, right? So what sizing would we use on this turn? I think we can have two sizings. I think we can be very polarized, or I think we can have a small sizing. This one might fall into a small sizing because we're still ahead of some king highs on turn. We're still ahead of some hands. However, this is a tough spot, actually. My default will be to check, though. So here's some advice. If you're stuck between a bunch of options in game and you don't know what to do, choose the one that is universally most popular. So check is the most popular. Even though we rolled, we might be missing out on some aggression here. Check is never going to be wrong, I'm pretty sure, in this spot. So I'm going to go with check. There you go. Check is pure. So makes sense to me. We have some showdown value, like I was saying. We beat some king highs. We have some good equity. We don't want to get raised. We want to see a river. We can hit a 4, right? So it makes sense to check here. Again, I think we have showdown value. Just going to check. Although the king does bring in an interesting scenario where now we only beat queen high, which I don't know if would have checked the turn and the river. I am going to check this time. But yeah, I guess we have enough showdown value. And they did in fact have the queen high that checked. So it does show that, we can have that hand still in villain's range that we beat, which is why we're probably going to be checking a lot. But if we had something a lot worse, maybe something like 6-5, maybe something like 8-9, right, that we floated flop with, then those are the combos I think we're going to find bluffs with. All right, I think that's going to wrap up this episode. For now, I don't want to keep these too long. I know I can get really in depth for each hand, but I hope you guys learned something from this session. Next, we're going to cover the next scenario. So we're going to move on from the big blind and small blind. So what I would do now is I would go back and I would go to the spot importance spreadsheet that I showed you guys earlier. And I would mark down how my score was small blind versus big blind. So for the combination of the two, I'll update this later for the next episode so you guys can see what my score was after practicing the small blind versus the big blind. All right. That does it for this episode. Please like and subscribe if you'd like to see more free content. Really appreciate all of your support. Thank you.